Okay, thank you everyone for coming. I think we're going to get started. So I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge all the unceded lands from where you all must be listening from, the online audience in particular, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. My name is Heba Adawy, and I'm a policy officer at Volunteering Australia, and I'll also be a facilitator for today. So the session on today, as you know, is volunteering in the context of settlement services and people from humanitarian and refugee backgrounds. So broadly, we will be discussing the motivations of volunteering within the space, the experiences of volunteers working within the space, and then we'll move on to questions of governance, and inclusion and diversity. So we have a lovely lineup of speakers here. First one is Anja Wendt, who is a PhD scholar at the University of New South Wales. Her research examines the motivation and experiences of people supporting refugees on their settlement journey in Australia. Anja has also volunteered in several refugee organizations herself. And then next up we have Emma Antonetti, who is the Manager Equity and Impact at Whittlesea Community Connections. She has worked in the community sector for over 20 years, and she also has extensive experience delivering settlement services to newly arrived migrants and refugees. And she's worked on a range of community-based projects to empower community. She also has a master's in social policy and recently completed a community fellows with the University of Melbourne. And finally, we have Janet and Kat O'Neill. So Janet Irvine is the manager of diversity training at the Settlement Services International, and she works to provide learning solutions that build culturally responsive workforces. And she also has extensive experience working with newly arrived families from refugee backgrounds as a counselor, caseworker, and educator. And finally, Kat O'Neill is the Community Engagement Manager at Settlement Services International, supporting multicultural communities to connect with the wider Australian community through their volunteer program. And she's also a deep thinker, interested in learning from our past to find innovative ways to create strong, connected communities. So with that, I will hand it over to our presenters. So we have roughly 15 minutes and then 20 minutes for the two of you, and then 15 minutes followed by question answer.
Yes. Hello. Hello, I'm Anja. I've actually spoken into microphone. I'm Anja. I also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people whose lands I'm presenting on. I come from the lands of Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm a student at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and my PhD is on exploring the relationship between volunteers and the refugee settlement sector in Australia. So before in this room, Gemma from the Center of Volunteering said it's a lot of stating the obvious. And then Paul from the Institute of Project Management said, we need to state the obvious. So I'm stating a lot the obvious, but there's hardly any research, or actually pretty much no research about this. So there might be a lot of yes, of course, but that is what my research is trying to do. It's trying to fill the academic gaps, or the gaps in the academic literature. Okay, now I have to multitask. Press a button and speak into the microphone. Okay, and talk. So what about volunteering and refugee settlement? So Australia currently resettles around 18,000 refugees annually. The number might be a little bit different, but it's around that. So Australia offers them, these refugees, a new home and provides them also with services such as linking them into Centrelink, banks, housing, helping with accommodation, helping with school enrollments, and so on. But as the influential indicators of integration from the UK Home Office state connection, and that would be bonding connection between within ethnic communities, bridging connections between communities, and also linking connections to higher authorities like government agencies, is crucial for settlement. And the good news is volunteers do exactly those. They deliver those connections, or they can deliver those connections. And so refugee volunteers from a refugee or migrant background would deliver the bonding connections, and then the volunteers from other backgrounds, migrant or non-migrant backgrounds, can deliver the bridging connections between the communities. And the other good news is those volunteers already support the settlement sector in large numbers. So because there's no or hardly any research about it, I was wondering, so why do they do that? I mean, we heard it a lot, so stating the obvious, but actually, there we go, multitasking didn't work. Yeah, that's my research questions. Why do they do that? Why do they volunteer in refugee settlement? Why don't they do it in sports or something like that? So why do volunteers engage with refugee settlement service providers or with a settlement sector? Not all are formal volunteers. And also, what motivates the service providers to engage the volunteers? Because as we know, they are not free. It's not, it's unpaid labor, but they are not free. My study is a qualitative study with semi-structured interviews. I identified two groups, the volunteers, obviously, and the settlement service providers. And those settlement service providers come from large settlement organizations like Settlement Services International, SSI, but also all kinds of organizations, institutions, networks, projects, supporting refugees along their settlement journey. So I interviewed 21 volunteers and 15 service providers, so it is not a representative study, but I still have interesting findings. And those are the motivation for volunteers in my study are altruism and helping, the normal I want to help. Career enhancement, a lot of volunteers volunteer to extend their networks or get something on their resume to apply for jobs in the sector or also out of sector. Learning about other cultures, other languages, socializing, I think that's obvious. Social justice, so not agreeing with government policies around refugees and asylum seekers. And volunteering to show that they don't, it's like an act of defiance. Bridging gaps, so finding what is missing and then volunteering or offering these services voluntarily. Giving back and paying forward. And guilt, which is also quite strong in usually Anglo-Saxon or white Caucasian volunteers. Who feel guilty about the colonial past. What I found also is that age and migration background matter. Gender, not so sure, because most of the volunteers are female, so maybe that's already saying something, but I can't really say more about that. But younger volunteers tend to volunteer for career enhancement reasons, and social justice, and older volunteers tend to volunteer to help, to socialize, and to learn about other cultures. People from refugee background tend to volunteer to bridge gaps, to give back, to socialize and also to for career enhancement, because they need to get some experience in the job market and also learn the language, English language. It's people from migrant but non-refugee background volunteer also to give back and socialize. People from migrant background, non-migrant background, non-recent migrant background, because I guess everybody has a migrant background somewhere, tend to volunteer because of social justice reasons and learning about other cultures. Okay, so because it's a qualitative study, I'm working with quotes. So that would be a quote about why somebody volunteers to enhance their careers. So Bofa says, I have never even volunteered or even thought about volunteering until now. I have no experience whatsoever within that sector. I want to gain a position in that kind of thing. I have to start volunteering, so at least just put in my resume, and so I actually can apply for jobs in that sector. So she changed her careers and needed to, or used volunteering to put that in her CV. Learning, Maza says, I'm very interested in kind of cross-cultural experiences, like for myself as well as for work. And that's what a lot of people said, that they want to learn about other cultures. Paying forward, Neha, who's a migrant from India, says, it's just kind of I'm just kind of aware of my reality, where I was in India, and I'm very aware of how lucky I am to have come here. I feel like it's something I need to pay forward and do something, even though it sounds more like giving back, but it's the concept of giving back or paying forward. And finally, an example for guilt is Molly, who's an English migrant. She says, working on this issue as an English economic migrant who has never really experienced any significant hardships that I haven't created myself. So it helps, the volunteering helps to assuage some of my guilt that I definitely carry. And stating the obvious, connection, I mean, that's come out a lot of times in this conference. Connection is the underlying theme. It's not necessarily connecting with refugees, because a lot of volunteers in the refugee settlement sector are also volunteering not with direct contact with refugees, just supporting the sector in the office, offering graphic design for free, offering office skills or unskilled labor in the office to free up the capacity of other staff. But it's always connection which comes up in all the interviews. So Shira, for example, feels a connection to the refugees she's working with, but she's not directly connecting with them. She says she's a migrant from Middle Eastern background. And she says, I often find that I feel some sense of familiarity or even similarity to some of the students, which is surprising. And that sense is set up, but it's a repeated thing. There are certain students, I think, from Middle Eastern background who I feel some sense of connection, and that's something which is really strong for her in her volunteering. Then Tyler is very intentional about his making connections. He says, I was volunteering him, a young Ethiopian refugee, and helping him with his homework and other things, as well as having a chat, building up that relationship and sort of getting to know him and his family a little bit better. And finally, Susie, who helped two refugee girls with their English, said, last year I was conversational English for two girls. Both of them had got a job. I was over the moon. I told my husband, and she goes on how happy she is and that she wanted to tell everybody. So there's a strong theme of connection coming through the volunteers. Okay. What about the service providers? So I already said volunteers as a free resource, yes, and that's coming through in the interviews, that the service providers need the unpaid labor to offer more services, to free up paid staff from the office to do other things like policy making, advocacy, or other other things. And then the other thing which is coming through a lot stronger is volunteers as community. And that's why I identified more themes under that. So again, connection as community, opportunities for refugee communities to participate. So there's the volunteering offers for refugee communities to engage them. Also to give them the opportunity to learn English and gain job skills, career enhancement. Then the programs offering broader community connections and friendships, like mentoring programs, offering those bridging connections between communities, particularly in the wider Australian community. The limitations of a caseworker who can't form deep connections and friendships, but a volunteer can. So a caseworker would be more to help with short-term needs, but the volunteer can then make a connection, a long-term connection, and support refugees longer than that. And also the volunteer programs offer an entrance into the refugee settlement sector for people who want to work there. A few more quotes. So for broader community connection and friendships, Sabrina says, I think that sharing of a time and sharing of a spirit is the most remarkable and moving thing. For a newcomer, they are the stories they share. They don't share the stories of English or their health appointment or knowing how to access Centrelink or the bank. They will talk to you, Australia is now my home. I love it in Australia. I've made friends. This is what we did on the weekend. They also always tell you about that human interaction, about connection. And then Philip says about the limitations of a caseworker. One of the weaknesses of professional casework is that people who are not connected by blood connection or community language connection to refugees can be less likely to come into contact with newly arrived refugees if there is a heavy reliance on professional services alone. I think what we are trying to do is to try to create and recreate some of those links that were lost in the past when refugees fled their countries, because that actually opens up all sorts of happy coincidences and connections. It can actually help people to find affordable housing through some sort of community network, get entry-level jobs, get introductions to people who may be able to provide advice and support. He talks about social capital, and which is created through connections. So, oh, there we go. So as a summary, motives like career guilt, paying back, play a role in volunteering. That's the first decision to volunteer is made based on these motivations. But largely volunteers continue volunteering because they build connections with the refugees or with the sector or with other volunteers, sometimes long-term relationships. So volunteers provide connection for refugees, but connecting with refugees is also the motive to keep them volunteering. Service providers understand the important role played by volunteers in providing connection, which is crucial for successful settlement. They support volunteers by creating opportunities and creating programs. And finally, some first conclusions. With connecting being so fundamental to refugee integration and volunteers providing this crucial connection, is relying on volunteers sufficient for successful integration. COVID showed how fragile a volunteer-reliant settlement service is when services get disrupted. Thus, settlement service providers should consider mixed models where volunteers are supported by dedicated caseworkers. And thank you.
Do you want me to just go? Yeah, okay, yeah. My name's Emma. I'm from Whittlesea Community Connections. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This land was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm from, oh, do you want me to, oh, I probably need a haircut. I'm from an organisation called Whittlesea Community Connections. You probably never heard of us. We're a place-based organisation in the outer suburbs of Melbourne in the north. It's a growing municipality. It's one of the largest growth corridors in Australia. Someone mentioned ABS stats around multicultural communities in Australia. In Whittlesea, it's 76% have a parent or both parents who were born overseas. So it's not something that is an afterthought for us or something that we need to plan later in our programs. It's very much central to who we are, and we really celebrate that as a key strength for us. Whittlesea Community Connections was born 50 years ago and was set up by one volunteer in the community who decided that people really needed a place to go for information support. For anyone who's familiar with traditional CABs, Community Advice Bureaus, that's how we started. We've grown since then, obviously, but that sense of who we are and that connection to being a volunteer-based organisation is really important to us. It's a value and it's something that we live every day. So even though now we have over 60 staff members, many of whom have started with us as volunteers and who started their journey in Australia as migrants or refugees, we still walk alongside over 200 volunteers who do a number of services. Our services have really grown in response to what our community tells us they want and need. And that is why for us being a place-based service is really important. We're not really interested in being scaling up or looking at being, reaching state or national kind of communities. We're really interested in working in our community and being really connected to that. So in terms of our growth, it really is in response to what people tell us, and our volunteers are very much part of that knowledge base. So, we started off with community information. That's, again, still a key integral part to who we are. But we do financial assistance, settlement support, community legal, prevention of family violence work, youth work, lots of things. And our latest thing is a farm. So it's pretty diverse. Volunteer resource service is also really key service for us. We don't just build capacity and connect volunteers through our own programs. We do that for the whole of community. So we connect in with other volunteer involving organisations and build their capacity also to be really inclusive. This project was a project with the Melbourne Social Equity Institute at the University of Melbourne, and I've got some names there just to acknowledge that their input and into the project. The reason why we really did this project is that because we work with volunteers with migrant and refugee experiences all the time, and we often struggle placing them into other volunteer opportunities because volunteer involving organisations will say to us, they're just newly arrived, they're not ready for it, the English level isn't good enough. They'll pose a number of barriers, and we say, but that's not our experience. Our experience is actually if you provide a really good opportunity and be flexible and respond to that, you'll actually find people do want to volunteer. And of course, newly arrived migrants and refugees have a number of other settlement priorities, but volunteering can and should be part of that settlement journey. So we actually did this not because we didn't know about this. We actually did have a very much an anecdotal and lived experience, but what we wanted was some evidence to show and to really put that back to other organisations. So if you're from a settlement experience sector here or work with newly arrived migrants and refugees, what I'm going to say to you is probably not going to be news to you, but hopefully like us, you'll say, okay, well, we can really use that as evidence to really back up what we know. And that's really what we've done, and we've tried to really do it in a way that gives migrant refugee communities that we work with an opportunity to really speak from their own perspective and lived experience. So yes, it was a research project, and actually the fellowship, when we were just talking about that, gives an opportunity for smaller organisations to build their research capacity, and they try and do that in a way that also has a practical application. So we applied through this fellowship, and anyone in Victoria, I suppose, who's here today, that I've got some information if you'd like to follow up later on. But we did have to go through ethics approval. We had a structure for how we would interview people. We did have a feedback session. So after we sort of identified the key themes, we put that back to the people we worked with just to sort of fine tune that. And in terms of who participated in the project, you can see there was definitely an overrepresentation of particular age groups and of women. So that's probably saying something in and of itself, and perhaps something we need to, that sort of has an implication for some of the findings. Migration stream, largely migrant refugee, but we also had some asylum seekers who participated. In terms of country of birth and languages spoken at home, pretty much reflects our community. So we have very much, you know, a large Syrian community who are newly arrived, but also Iraqi, Iranian, and many, many languages. So in terms of newly arrived, 16 arrived, out of the 20 arrived within the last 5 years. But I think what's really wonderful about this is to show that really within the first 1 or 2 years of settlement, most participants had volunteered. So I think there is a real keen interest and a real big opportunity there. So 20 people, 34 different roles. So they weren't just volunteering in one position or one role, they were doing multiple things within their community. And it was within their own community in terms of places of worship, but it was in lots of other sectors as well. So group work, food relief, education, sports, you name it, it's there. So it was really, really pleasing to see that. I think this is a really good one too in terms of just practice implications. If you're thinking about how to really recruit, engage, promote to this cohort, that referral pathway in terms of it being from the school they were in or a school placement was basically how they got into volunteering. So really good connections with the AMEP provider, really encouraging teachers or building teachers' awareness of volunteering is really critical, I think, there. Reasons for volunteering, and it probably picks up on some of Anja's research, really diverse. Employment obviously is there, but it wasn't just about that. It was understanding culture and cross-cultural communication skills, work rights in Australia, improving English. The last two were probably less common, but I just wanted to note those in terms of no work rights for asylum seekers. They couldn't actually get paid for those who couldn't get paid work. Volunteering was the only option. So I think it's really important for that group. Really is the only way to be part of community and to participate. There are some quotes there. I can't read them from here, but maybe you can, I'll give you a couple of minutes maybe to read them. Benefits and outcomes, and this is really self-identified, and we tried to put them in key themes, but there were just so many. You know, English, not uncommon, not, you know, dissimilar to the broader community, I suppose, but some other things that are more particular to newly arrived communities. So, you know, work experience, and just a note there that 7 of the people that we spoke to actually got a job in the place they were volunteering in. So I think we often, you know, in terms of, I also do a lot of work in the employment sector, and volunteering just never comes up in the conversation. And there's always me putting my hand up saying, but what about volunteering? What about volunteering? It's such a missed opportunity, but such an important pathway for people. And then there's always those other reasons like helping community, reducing isolation. Identifying skills and pathways I think was an interesting one because it allowed people to know what they were good at and to be able to have the conversation with their volunteer manager about, actually I found out I'm really good at this or I really like this, and to sort of find yourself. You know, if you've got to build your whole new career in a new country, your skills aren't recognised here, you sort of got to start again. You've got to go back to the drawing board, but volunteering really helps you think that through. Cross-cultural skills, helping others. So that sense of I know what it was like, And when somebody helped me, really made a difference, and I want to do that for somebody else. I'm feeling settled, building networks, improving mental health. And this one came up a bit too, just changing the perception of refugees and people seeking asylum. There's a lot of negative media out there, and people want to be really active in changing the story around that. And there's some quotes there, but I might just read a couple and leave the rest for you to read. But Australia is helping migrants a lot by welcoming people to come, really open the door for refugees, and we want to give Australia back what they gave us and help people. I feel good about myself. I give back. I was happy. I felt myself a better person. The one above that in orange about the family relationship, I think is really important too. I think, you know, when you come here and you've left all your family and friends, that sense of your workplace or where you're volunteering becoming your new family is really important. And often I think we don't see it in the same way, and we can overlook that. So I think having sort of creating opportunities for people to really build that in Australia is important. There's some more quotes, and I suppose like Anja, it was a qualitative piece, so there was just so many quotes, and I found it really hard to select them. But yeah, just another one there. When I found someone who spoke my language, it made it easier for me to know how important it is to have someone from your culture to help you. People think refugees and asylum seekers are just bad people, but I'm trying to change that view. Not everyone is bad, so we can't generalise. So that's the main thing I focus on, help the community, trying to change the view of us and refugees. And I suppose in the conversations we had with people really also spoke to, you know, what was working, what they liked about their volunteering experience and what could be better, and how could we make that a better volunteer and settlement experience for people to come. In terms of what worked, people really spoke about the flexibility, so being able to fit volunteering in between learning English, taking the kids to school, health appointments, all those other things, having welcoming environments, opportunities to continue to learn, knowing that you're making a difference to the community. And I was in a session earlier today and they were talking about impact and, you know, really connecting the impact to the volunteers so they know exactly what it is, what difference they're making to community. And obviously recognition and celebration, which I'm sure that you all know these things and do them as well. So in terms of opportunities for improvement, there were some things that came out of what people said. In terms of systems and services, it was really making those connections. You know, we work so much in silos still, even though we talk about this all the time, but, you know, really building the connections between settlement services, volunteer and the volunteering sector. I think there still is a very big disconnect, but there's lots of other opportunities too. You know, if people are talking about improved mental health, connections to employment, where are all those other connections that we're making? And I spoke to that, the second point earlier again, is just that connection to English language school as absolutely critical. In terms of the people volunteering for us, we know that it is the relationship we have with the teacher at AMEP that will promote volunteering and support placements. And systemic barriers, I think there was a session this morning that spoke to this, that not everyone can afford to volunteer. And if you're here, you know, relying on Centrelink or no Centrelink, you're living in an outer suburban regional area where there's no transport. You've got lots of kids, you know, in school, out of school. There are just so many barriers. And I think if we're really serious about this, we've got to try and put some money into it. Otherwise, yeah, if we're striving for diversity, we've really got to look at this. And I think things like transport reimbursements, supporting with women around childcare, and anything that you think is going to make a difference around some of these things. And I don't have all the answers, but the volunteers that you have will. And I think it's about having a really honest conversation about some of these things. Information is key, and how we give information, at what points we give information, I think is really critical. And I think the lesson here is that there's no time, there's no need to wait. You know, we can't say we'll wait for someone to be settled to introduce volunteering. I think we introduce volunteering as soon as we can, It might not mean that everyone's ready at that time, but that people should have access to that information early on. And of course that we're providing that information in culturally accessible ways. You know, we spoke to volunteers who said, look, I never really saw myself in any of the posters or the visuals, or having a story, someone coming to tell me from their own experience of being a newly arrived migrant and refugee, what the benefit of volunteering is. And I think, you know, when we talk about providing information about volunteering, just going that extra step, acknowledging that people need a little bit more information, because it may be different, obviously. People volunteer in their own countries, but it looks really different. So trying to explain that, simplify that, but also make the link to employment and information about rights and responsibilities. People we spoke to were also taken advantage of in the workplace, so that information is also critical. And then volunteer management practices, and I know the next presenters are going to go into this a little bit more, but you know, some of the things that people did identify was some of that cultural orientation to a workplace is really important for people. Tailoring volunteer roles to people's motivations, and I know that we've spoken, I feel like I've heard that a lot over the last couple of days, but I think we probably don't do that as well as we can, and that's maybe for time issues or whatever it might be, but if particularly around employment, if people are coming because they're looking for a job, it's like, how do we then use the volunteering to help that person get a job? So if people are coming with these really great skills, but we're giving them a role that's down here, what's the point of that? You know, we want to upskill, we want to, and if people, you know, get that job and they're doing the volunteer really well, what's the next thing for them? What's the other thing they can really excel at or get better at? So I think it's always about trying to, reflect on that and build the volunteer role around the person as opposed to the other way around. And look, we didn't speak to many young people in this project, but I think the other thing to highlight through this is that youth-specific strategies are definitely needed. It doesn't work in the same way for young people. The young people we worked with through this project and just generally in the workplace is, particularly if you're newly arrived, maybe having a group of other young people that you're volunteering with, so you're doing it in a bit of a friendship group, a gentle sort of introduction to volunteering, as opposed to going straight to the formal volunteering, was something that worked, but we probably need to think better about that too. And that idea around the volunteering place being your family network. If you have no one else, how do we really create that and help people feel really welcome, and that they can come for other, you know, if they need to ask other questions or they need help for other things, that it's okay, you know, that is their support network. And I'm sure you all do that really well anyway, but I think it's just important to highlight. And I think that's it for me. I do have little printouts of the thing, but I'll just apologise in advance because I didn't realise it was this small. So you probably need, it's not very accessible, but I do have little printouts. And if you want to know a little bit more about the Community Fellows program, there's a link there as well. Yeah, thank you. Get all our stuff together here. I too want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today and the lands from which people are joining us online. Pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend those respects to my colleagues, my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues in the room. As a white settler Australian working in a settlement context, working with cultural humility has become my journey, and learning what it means to be an ally in this context. I've worked in the settlement sector for
I guess most of my life and over 30 years, and I'm extremely grateful for the invitation people have given me and the patience and generosity as I've tried to better myself over that time. SSI, for those of you who don't know, is short for Settlement Services International. We're a not-for-profit based in New South Wales, and we were established to provide settlement support for people arriving under the humanitarian program in New South Wales. Over the last 23 years, we've provided services to people from refugee background, people from migrant background, people seeking asylum in Australia. And I guess you'll see from those different coloured circles that over that time, we've kind of expanded our services to meet some of those other broader needs that people bring, because they don't just bring their migrant and refugee experience, they bring their whole selves. And that includes their aspirations for employment, their aspirations for entrepreneurship, their aspirations for living their full potential, whether with all of their identities, their gender, their body identities, all the things that we bring with us. And I guess one of the things we've found is that through working with those culturally and linguistically diverse communities, we've honed our skills in working inclusively for those communities. And it's taught us a bit to be able to translate some of those experiences into working inclusively more broadly. And so, you know, we ground our delivery in that experience. I guess I also just want to note that, you know, when we have up there people seeking asylum, a little bit of a celebration that finally we've seen some movement in our current system, and that those people who've been living in limbo for so many years are hopefully finally going to find some security and a sense of future here. One of the other things that we find at SSI, so we are an organisation that has grown a lot. Whilst we started in New South Wales, we now work across Victoria and Queensland as well. And we have a staff of over 1,000 people now working across all of those programs. And in a recent staff survey, 70% of our staff identify as having been born overseas. So diversity is a fact for us. We like to think of it as our superpower, but we also know that it's only our superpower if we create an inclusive workplace and we create inclusion. It's inclusion that converts and unlocks the potential and the benefits of that diversity. So it's no good just collecting a group of diverse people in an organisation if we're not making that choice around equity and working and putting in strategies to build inclusion, so that we do get those benefits both individually for ourselves and for our organisation and the communities that we work with. But I guess just to get a sense of how do we know whether we've achieved that inclusion, because we can talk about inclusion a lot, but what does that actually mean? If we look at the research that the Diversity Council of Australia does every couple of years with their Inclusion at Work Index, they survey workers from all across Australia, across a whole range of sectors. What has come out of that research is that people feel included when they feel respected and valued for who they are and what they bring. When they feel connected to the people around them, to the organisation, to the organisational vision. When they feel like they're contributing and they can see their contributions to the success of whatever they're working on. And when they can see that there's an opportunity to progress in that organisation. One of the biggest things we see in Australia, one of the struggles across corporate Australia, and someone mentioned it yesterday, you need to see it to be it. And so if you can't see progression, opportunities within your organisation, then you don't feel included. You don't feel like there's a place for you. And we know from that research that people are 10 times more likely to feel satisfied if they feel inclusion in their team, and that translates to 4 times less likely to leave the organisation. So for those of us in the room who are involved in recruitment, whether it's for paid or unpaid workforce, we want, you know, as much as possible to provide satisfying experiences. We want, hopefully, to have longer relationships with people, or if not, that they get the opportunities to progress elsewhere. But when we talk about recruitment, so whatever your role in this, of people in the room, some of you might be involved directly in volunteer management and recruitment. Some of you might have other roles within the organisation. And I guess what Kat and I wanted to kind of show today is a case study of, I guess, the context of our volunteer program, as well as the strategies that that program implements to try and create more opportunities for our diverse communities. But one of the things we need to understand is that volunteering programs sit within an ecosystem within their organisation. And if you're involved in that day-to-day volunteer management and recruitment, you can have influence, but you also need to be supported by the system you're within. So you need to be supported by the leadership. There needs to be a strong commitment of leadership to inclusion. So if I think of our organisation, we have strong representation in our leadership team of people who are from migrant and refugee backgrounds. We have, in the last 6 years actually, 6 years ago, really committed resources to building inclusion, not just around cultural and linguistic diversity, because inclusion isn't about raising one group above another. It's about looking at everyone. And so we've invested in people who lead our diversity inclusion work, and it's connected to our strategy and it's connected to our BP, our business objectives, so that there's accountability at that leadership level. And then you also need an organisational system and process that supports the work that you do with your volunteers, that supports that inclusive process. So, you know, a couple of examples in our organisation is that we have staff reference groups around different aspects of inclusion that can feed back to us. What are the issues? What are the barriers? And they're inclusive of our volunteers. They participate in those opportunities as staff. And we also have recently implemented cultural wellbeing leave, which is available to everyone across the organisation, additional to their other leave. And I guess that's another demonstration of how it's committing to that inclusive workplace and recognising that diversity is something we value and that we celebrate, and that we know that culture makes us stronger if we're given the opportunity to connect with that. And then at the individual level, it's about how does your organisation build your capability. Back when I started my career, it was working cross-culturally was seen as a specialist skill. It was seen, you know, you would have organisations who had that specialist skill and people would refer people into your organisation. As we've heard a number of times, 1 in 2 Australians now were either born overseas or had at least one parent born overseas. It's no longer a specialist skill. It has to be a core capability of everybody, because this is who we are. This is our reality now. This is our fact. And I think that commitment to that and that understanding, shifting our mindset to going, this is who we are, and all of us understanding that and developing ourselves, because it's a lifelong development to get better at it. And it is about building our self-awareness. It is about cultural humility, being open, less judgmental, and approaching our work with our colleagues and our clients with that openness to learn from each other and find more culturally inclusive ways and relevant ways to work with each other. Kat's now going to shift to the actual volunteer program.
Hi, everyone. I have a quiet voice, so I definitely need a microphone. The clicker's working. So Janet just spoke about SSI's commitment to investing in inclusion of our diverse volunteers as well as our staff, and the importance of organizations investing at all different levels. I'm now going to share who our volunteers are at SSI. So 72% are from humanitarian or migrant backgrounds. Many are former clients, and I do say the word client just because it's very easy for me to say here, but what I mean is people that come to our organization for support. Many are former clients with forced migration backgrounds or family who have such backgrounds. They speak 53 different languages, and 60% speak 2 or more languages fluently. And our volunteers who don't speak the languages of our clients, they may speak a different language, but they still come with their migrant background. So as we heard from the previous presenters, I'll just briefly touch on this, that volunteering supports settlement of people from refugee backgrounds. And it provides, as we've heard, social connection, local work experience, workplace culture, knowledge, skills, access to local networks, opportunities to practice conversational English and learn jargon, and many, many more benefits that Anja and Emma have touched on. I just wanted to provide my own quotes from our volunteer program. We do a biannual survey of our volunteers, and I just wanted to share a couple quotes of what our volunteers have shared with us. So Nazrin is a volunteer with our multicultural foster care program, and she has told us that SSI provided me with multiple free trainings as a volunteer, which certainly helped my professional development. Sharni, our community activity volunteer, has told us, I love being part of an activity and interacting with other like-minded women. So that connection. As we all know, why we're all here, there are challenges in recruitment and retention of volunteers. And I wanted to share some of those that we have experienced in working with volunteers from refugee and migrant backgrounds. And I'm going to go through with that in a little bit at that leadership, organizational, and individual level. So as Janet mentioned, again, I'll go back to inclusive strategies can't just be focused on volunteer managers or others in the organization. It needs to come with a commitment from the leadership at the top, and that's a huge challenge already, a huge hurdle if it's not there. At an organizational level, inclusive recruitment practices are needed. A good example of a barrier is, as we all know, reaching any volunteer is difficult, let alone a volunteer or, well, an individual from refugee or migrant backgrounds. Many, as we've heard throughout the last 2 days, aren't aware of the opportunities or understand the benefits of volunteering for different reasons. Perhaps they don't access the channels to know that the opportunities are out there. They may get their information through trusted sources, those community social media channels, ethnic groups, and that might be for many reasons due to their forced migration experiences or that's in language and culturally appropriate format for them. And also, as we probably, many of us in the room have heard, that the idea of volunteering is very cultural, is very different in different cultures. So again, they may not realize the benefits of volunteering for them. And then at an individual level, even if people do know the benefits, they trust the source, they understand what opportunities are out there for them. And we've also heard this previously, they may lack the resources to engage in volunteering. So financial resources from basic things like transport, and that's because many people from refugee backgrounds arrive with the clothes on their backs, so they have no financial resources. And then settlement takes time and it takes energy, and so that is a resource that if they're not aware of the benefits for settlement, that is another challenge. This is where I wanted to spend most of the time, what's worked for us. And saying that, what's worked for us, it's also, we're learning. So we're here to learn from you as well during question time. So at that leadership value, again, Janet spoke about SSI's commitment and representation, so I won't go into that. But at an organizational level, one important thing that we see is that our volunteer program sits within the community engagement team. I'm the community engagement manager, and that's really recognition that it's a deliberate decision, and it recognizes that relationships are crucial to that volunteering side of things. We don't expect people to come to us. We find them, we find ways to engage with them. We have engagement strategies. Just a quick example around this. From our experience after the fall of Afghanistan a few years ago, many people found safety in Australia. I think SSI had 2 hours noticed that people were arriving, and so we had to spring into action immediately. So we did have some existing relationships with the Afghan community here, but we also realized immediately we needed to strengthen those relationships. So tapping into community engagement in our volunteer program, we went out into the community. We went into, and it also depends on how those communities work. With the Afghan community, we went into their community organizations, their spaces, their events, and we talked to them in a space that was safe for them. And again, strengthened those relationships. And so that led to many people putting up their hand to volunteer with us, wanting to give back to the community, all those motivations that we heard from before. Another practice that works well for us is partnering. So finding people from refugee backgrounds, partnering is really, really crucial. When the Ukrainian conflict began almost a year ago to the week, we had an immediate need for both staff and volunteers from Ukrainian background, and that's not something that we had, that's not a community we had engaged before, but again, we tapped into those engagement strategies, and we reached out to the Ukrainian community in very, very different ways than the Afghan community, because we noticed the Ukrainian community is very structured, they are very hierarchical, they wanted a virtual meeting, they wanted minutes of that meeting, so you have to tap into ways those communities work. And we ended up partnering, and so they agreed to share our volunteer roles on their social media platforms, and we agreed to share, they wanted to start an English language club, and we're struggling to engage with native English speakers, and so we agreed to share their roles with some of our existing volunteer pools. As well as some of our other existing partners. And so again, it's not just about us, it's about a mutual benefit. What can we give each other? I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but all of our volunteer program policies, procedures, principles commit to inclusion. We offer really flexible onboarding, recruitment, retention, recognition strategies. Flexibility is key. For example, our governance checks are trauma-informed. People who come in from a forced migration background would have anxiety. They would have told their story a million times to a million different services, people, as they've gone through that process. And that can create anxiety. So we really explain our confidentiality and privacy policies. We explain why we're doing what we're doing. And we're slow, and we take it through slowly if needed. We offer support, filling out forms. We onboard over the phone, in person, virtually, however they want. We come to them. Our role descriptions are in simple English. We do things like skill matching. We found out about who they are, what they want to offer. We sit down and learn about them, their motivations. And we also have a device library. Now I know not everybody has the resources to do that, but we did during the pandemic. We set up mobiles and laptops. It's a small library and data as well, so that a mother who's caring at home for her children can volunteer. We have had roles where people can volunteer from home, some roles, and that's part of that matching process. And then we can supply them with a laptop and data. And an example of that through our humanitarian settlement program. Sometimes case managers need support in doing non-case management and checking in. And those volunteers can do that, and they speak the language, and they connect in that way. So yeah, good example of that. And then training. All of our volunteers have access to the same training as paid staff and as our paid staff to build their skills, knowledge. We have mandatory training, so culturally responsive practice, so they can build their culturally responsive practice, trauma-informed practice, child mandatory reporting, and then we can suggest some based on their roles, but they can also access anything. They can have a look. And then there's some specific skill building, and that's around, a good example of that is around many, again, are from the communities that they are supporting, so there's boundary skills that we need to talk to them about. They are in 2 roles, and our staff as well, they're in 2 roles. And there's a lot of pressures around coming into that, a lot of expectations from their community. So making sure that they're safe as well, their trauma isn't triggered and things like that. So just to wrap up, just to conclude, so we have many strategies to build an ecosystem of inclusion at SSI with our volunteers, but also staff at an organizational leadership and individual level. So looking at that, we're still learning. We're still learning our strategies. It's a continuous improvement kind of environment. And I think the important thing is that we're committed to that culture of inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have 15 minutes, but thank you so much for talking about the benefits of volunteering, both for those who do volunteer and as well as those who come from humanitarian backgrounds. So I have a few sort of discussion points, and then I'll take a series of questions from the audience. So number one is, how do we think about the challenges faced by people from humanitarian backgrounds, not in terms of volunteering, but in terms of sort of balancing the expectation to volunteer for employability with the very real priorities they may have in terms of settlement, as you said, and in terms of finding a financial ground. So that's number one. And number two is that how do we rethink the idea that refugees may not be beginning from ground zero, but they might be coming in with very skilled qualifications. So in terms of volunteering, how do we see volunteering as a translational sort of exercise that helps connect those skills and helps accreditate, give them the right accreditation for those skills and build onto job placements that might be commensurate with that. So that's sort of my 2 discussion points, but we'll take some more questions from the audience.
I think you touched on it earlier, more around the boundaries question, because I work in the refugee and humanitarian entrance space, and one of the challenges with retaining volunteers is the restrictions that they feel they have when organizations tell them that you can't really pay for their groceries because you're a volunteer. You need to empower them to be able to access services. So how does SSI deal with that?
We might take one more. I think there was another hand up, or two of those, and then, yeah.
Hi, my name is Janet. I'm also from the humanitarian settlement space in Queensland. So a couple of months ago, we spoke to community leaders in our Ukrainian and Afghani communities around volunteering. And the question that kept coming was around, you guys are saying volunteering, we want you to help you to volunteer more. And they were saying, we are already volunteering. And so the question is around formal and informal volunteering and how we approach our communities around making it clear on what our expectations are. Because what I heard from the community leaders was, Janet, we are doing it. So are you saying, as an Australian community, we want you to formalize you going to help out a community member who needs help or buying them groceries? Are you saying we wanted to document and say this is exactly what you're doing? So my question is, are we asking our communities to formalize volunteering when they're already doing it?
Thank you. And I think Joni had one, so yeah. And then we'll come back to you. So that's a lot of questions, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Joni from Volunteering SANT, and previously worked in settlement services in SA. My question was more around, so we've been doing a lot of consultations with new arrival community leaders and people from new arrival backgrounds, predominantly former refugees. And one of the questions we get asked a lot by those cohorts is, yes, they do want to maybe step into that space, get a taste of formal volunteering. But one of they see as a limitation is the limited amount of English at times. That's not applicable to everyone, obviously. But we do get asked, what can I do as a volunteer in that formal volunteering way? And being now in the volunteer sector and understanding, you know, the different steps of onboarding volunteers, there's multiple barriers along the way. I'd love to hear from the panel, what could be some takeaways for us in the volunteer sector of reducing some of those barriers for people to formally volunteer and really make it easier for new arrivals to be getting all those great skills and confidence and civic participation, etc.
I can start. There was quite a few questions there. I might touch on I might actually say that coming from a community engagement background, we first and foremost want to support communities to do what they do best. It's fantastic if they join our formal volunteering, but what we'd rather do is support them to do volunteering or to support their community in ways they want to. That's what we really want to do. So if they don't want to join our formal volunteering program, I know that's terrible because I support a formal volunteer program, but that's great. That means they're doing it, and that's what we really want. I think the boundary question that you asked, it's a tricky one, and there isn't any right way, but it is setting up, you do need to, if you're talking about formal volunteering, it's setting up those structures and those expectations and having those conversations. First, we do those in layers of knowledge, because it's a lot of information coming at you at once, in an induction formally, in our policies and procedures formally. But then all of our volunteers are supervised, and that needs to be done at that. It's much like checking in with your staff member as well, checking in, having those conversations. Many people are social workers, and that's not my background, but our supervisors of volunteers are in programs and social workers. And they get taught that reflection time is crucial in supervision. And so if people are feeling that pressure, first of all, you have to build the trust that they're actually going to share that with you. And also you need to set aside that time to reflect with them. And sometimes it's just listening as well. You may not be able to solve that, but setting up those expectations around why those boundaries are important. And there's a level of organizational importance as well. You just need to be honest about that. And if you do see a volunteer that is, again, going beyond those boundaries, well, maybe a formal volunteering program isn't right for them, but you can support them to find a role somewhere in the community that is where they belong with those skills.
I might just add to that as well. We do some work around, because a large part of our workforce are also bicultural, And so we do a lot of communities of practice around what does that mean, working for and with your own community. So there's a lot of support around that, trying to manage some of those boundaries, but there's other things that you're managing, vicarious trauma and re-traumatisation, a whole range of things that we don't have to deal with. So it's really important that bicultural workers have that additional support, have their own support networks and have additional capacity building that really speaks to those additional pressures. I think it's probably an under-resourced area in a lot of organisations, unfortunately. But we use those skills, but we don't necessarily recognise them or reward them in the way they should be. I would agree that in terms of informal, formal volunteering, it's really about what community wants to do, and we should be supporting that. So much happens in that informal space that is amazing and fantastic. And I suppose our role is about just to say, well, what is it that you need to strengthen that? We don't want to take you away from that, but also to know that there are these other opportunities, and should you ever want to come and do something over here that might link to your own personal aspirations or employment or anything, just letting you know that that's also there. So I think we should support both. And in terms of your question around supporting the recruitment, onboarding process and thinking of other roles for people where English, people are still learning on that. So I think there's a few things around that also. I mean, we also work, again, the bicultural workforce is really instrumental for us around that. So they really support volunteers from their own community to learn about volunteering, feel comfortable about the idea of volunteering, explain what the process is. So there's a lot of work in that engagement space that happens before you even say, yeah, okay, this is the role. And again, finding out what it is that volunteer would like out of volunteering. And unfortunately, a lot of organisations perhaps aren't as, it depends how flexible you can be in organisations, but ideally you want to try and create a role that really suits that. And I know that's really tricky because often we say, okay, we need volunteers to drive a bus or we need volunteers to do this, but there could be support roles that work alongside those volunteers also, where they can be mentored or buddied. So for example, we have a community transport service for sure. So we've got a driver, but we always have a driver assistant role. So there's someone there next to the driver helping them navigate or opening doors for elderly. So there's always a support role or thinking about how somebody can enter but build at the same time. But I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I just wanted to say in terms of boundaries, that came up a lot in the interviews. And what I observed was that the larger the organization is, and also particularly with mentoring roles where it's there's a lot of contact and it's really like going into a deeper relationship, there's more boundary issues, and there need to be more boundaries, more formal boundaries. But then there's a smaller or emerging organization, so maybe that would be a better fit then, as you said, where people meet on the basis that there's no boundaries and they can make friendships and then go around these boundaries on another way. But I guess it really depends on the organization or the formalization of a volunteering. And I think what I observed or what I heard in the interviews a lot of times, I was like, yeah, but in that one you actually need those boundaries, even though people don't like it, because there's too much responsibility in there if everybody starts acting like that. And I also heard stories about mentors wanting to engage refugees as cleaning staff, or refugees actually wanting to be the cleaners for their mentors. So there's a lot of things where it gets really difficult to and where there need to be boundaries. But yeah, the smaller the organization, I guess, the easier it is.
Thanks. And I guess the question, or I guess the point that I had was, how do we rethink or think about skill-based volunteering for refugees that are already bringing that skill set. And I think that means also rethinking the way we place or draw boundaries between internships and professional placements versus what we might call volunteering. So how do we help them enable or make that extra step towards strengthening what they've already got, because they might not be well placed in their voluntary positions to build on what they've already achieved. So what we can do is we can take a few round of questions, but we won't have time to answer them because we're already at 3, but we can still take some questions and comments and then leave it there so that it's food for thought and it's a sort of an ongoing process of thinking through something. So if there's any other comment or question, just feel free to throw it and then we can just take it from there. Yes.
I don't have any question, but just wanted to thank all the presenters for the valuable information. Appreciate all the efforts and all the work you have done. But I want to say another special thank you for community, because actually 2009 when I arrived, I used your service. Small word, yeah. So I was new to the country. I think some people they know the story, but I'm not gonna talk about it. It's gonna take a long time. But I was stressing out. I got a car accident and I got hit, and I was just 3 months in the country. I didn't know what to do, and your team helped me to link me with legal aid, and we solved it because I didn't know the roles like in the system in Australia. I got hit from behind, but I was targeted and people chasing me up to come and fix their car, but they're supposed to fix my car. Thank you. Can you please give them a round?
I think we're good. I don't think we have any further comments or questions. So thank you so much. And I really want to thank you for this discussion. And thank you all for joining us.